Good afternoon, and a hearty welcome to all of you to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The Wilson Center is delighted to welcome His Excellency Professor Bingu Mutharika, the President of the Republic of Malawi, and Her Excellency Madame Mutharika, the First Lady. I also want to thank those members of the President's delegation who are with us today. I'm Mike Van Dusen, Executive Vice President of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Jane Harman, the President and CEO of the Center, regrets very much she could not be here. In fact, she is speaking 10 blocks away from here at the United States Archives in an event that was scheduled many months ago. The Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars serves as a national living memorial honoring Woodrow Wilson. In providing an essential link between the worlds of ideas and public policy, the Center addresses current and future challenges confronting our nation and the world. The Center promotes policy-relevant research and dialogue to increase understanding and be instrumental in enhancing the capabilities and knowledge of leaders, citizens, and institutions worldwide. Created by an act of Congress 42 years ago, the Wilson Center is a nonpartisan institution supported by both public and private funds. In seeking to bring a wide spectrum of people together to discuss critical issues, we have a confident hope that from their dialogue on public policy issues, participants can learn from each other, the work of all will be enriched, and better understanding and better policy can emerge. The Wilson Center does essentially two things. We convene meetings trying to bring together key individuals from government, the private sector, the NGO world, and academia to discuss public policy issues of mutual interest. And second, we also bring to Washington in the course of a year over 150 scholars and policymakers from all over the world to do their own research and writing. The Center's work and its scholarship commemorates the ideals and concerns of Woodrow Wilson's. Today's Directors Forum is very much in the Wilsonian tradition. Professor Mutharika, like Woodrow Wilson, is both a scholar and a policymaker. He has a master's degree in economics, I believe from the University of Delhi, and a doctorate in development economics coming from Pacific Western University in Los Angeles. He has taught and written extensively. Professor Mutharika was elected President of Malawi in 2004 and re-elected in 2009 with 60% of the vote. In 2010, he served as Africa Union Chair. Professor Mutharika, welcome. It is my pleasure to turn the podium over to Steve McDonald, the Consulting Director for the Woodrow Wilson Center's Africa Program and its program on leadership and building state capacity. Steve has brought enormous leadership to the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I want to thank him and his colleagues, Mamkhadi Diouf and Derek Langford and Ali Lyons for their work in helping put together this meeting today. Steve, we appreciate your contributions. Steve will moderate this session. I know you will have a productive session. Steve, the floor is yours. And again, welcome to all of you, and thank you for being at the Wilson Center.
Thank you very much, Mike. And let me add my welcome to Mike's for your presence here. I know we all have busy schedules, and we appreciate the fact that you choose to come, but we know that you've come for a very good reason today. I need to do no more introduction for the President. President Mutharika is a well-known figure, but what we're talking about today is an initiative that he started while he was chairing the Africa Union. The Africa Food Basket Initiative was decided at last year's Africa Union Heads of State Summit, which was presided over by the President. Its objective is to achieve the ability of Africa to feed itself within 5 years. That's no child should die of hunger, malnutrition, or starvation. The Africa Food Basket highlights agriculture and food security as a springboard for growth supported by strategic transport infrastructures, energy development, information communication technology, and climate change mitigation. The President will be speaking about all of these things. It's particularly of interest to us, I think, as you well know, as the United States, and through USAID in particular, has gotten extremely involved in food security on the continent, spearheaded by our Feed the Future initiative. And I know there are some people in the audience who are working on those initiatives. And so we're very, very thankful to have the President here to speak about this today. The President chooses to speak from the table so he can be comfortable, which shows that he's a wise man. He's not going to stand up here in front of you. I do want to take just a moment before I turn the podium over to him to recognize, of course, the First Lady, Her Excellency Calista Mutharika, who's the First Lady of the Republic. We also have the Honorable Abba Shawa, who's the Minister for Development, Planning, and Cooperation. Thank you, who's accompanying the President. And we have the Honorable Nicholas Dowsey, who's the Deputy Minister for Presidential Affairs and Member of Parliament. Thank you very much. Of course, my colleague and who I've worked with very closely on this initiative, Steve Matenje and his wife Isabel, who was the ambassador from Malawi to the United States. Thank you very much, Steve, for your support in this. And thank you, Mrs. Matenje, for your support for Steve. I'm sure that makes it work. Finally, we have Brian Bowler, His Excellency, the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the Republic of Malawi to the United Nations. I believe that Ambassador the Congolese ambassador was going to join us today, but I don't see her in the audience. So, okay, just make sure I hadn't missed her. So, because she's the Dean of the Corps. Okay, with no further ado, then I'm going to turn it over to President Mutharika for his address.
Thank you, Steve. The advantage of being an old man like me is that you can sit down and give a lecture and get away with it. So I hope that I'll be able to do that. The Director of Ceremonies, Excellency, the First Lady of the Republic of Malawi, Mr. Michael Van Duzen, Vice President of the Woodrow Wilson Center, Ambassador John A. Carson, Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Mr. Steve Matenje, the Ambassador of Malawi to the United States of America, honorable members of the United States Congress, if any, here, members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon to you all, my friends. Thank you. I am privileged to give this lecture this afternoon in this prestigious Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars. I want to thank Ms. Jane Harman for facilitating me to meet you this afternoon. I also want to thank you all for coming this afternoon to share with me the challenges of making Africa produce enough food to feed its people. The title of my lecture is Africa Feeding the World Through Technological Innovations and Strategic Partnerships. The detailed analysis of this topic will be found in the main paper, The African Food Basket, that I believe will be distributed to you later. I'll start off my lecture by stating that the greatest challenge facing humanity in modern times is not the threat from nuclear proliferation, but the threat to peace and security arising from failure to produce enough food to feed humanity. Global news headlines talk of growing food insecurity and escalating food prices that have led in some countries to food riots and political unrest. It is a fact that peacekeeping forces throughout the world cannot be sustained if the soldiers do not have enough food to eat. This is generally a fact that is forgotten even by international institutions. National armies cannot be sustained if the soldiers have no food to eat. Global campaigns to fight HIV, AIDS, maternal, child, and infant mortality cannot be effective without adequate food and nutrition, and even children in school cannot learn well if their stomachs are empty. The challenge to global food security includes adverse climate change, persistent droughts and floods, and severe storms. In most parts of the world, including Africa, severe constraints to agriculture and food production range from inability of large sections of populations to access cheap food due to extreme poverty, low farm inputs such as fertilizers, improved seeds, and technology adoption, impacts of HIV and AIDS on human resources, and lack of resilient institutional capacities to minimize such adverse impacts on fragile economies. These issues are compounded by inadequate policy interventions, low budgetary provisions, low private sector investment, minimal value addition, and poor product differentiation, and inadequate and poor food storage and preservation. When I developed the concept of the African food basket, I was aware of all these challenges. I was also aware that the world has over 9 billion people to feed, and that more than 1 billion of them are constantly threatened by starvation. Each one of the 9 billion people must have at least 1 meal a day in order to survive. Some of the people have 3 meals a day, and still many others do not even have 1 meal a day. I was actually conscious that in Africa, the population is now nearly 900 million people, and estimates show that in less than 1 decade, there will be 1 billion mouths to feed. I was also aware that about 70% of the African populations live in rural areas under extreme poverty, deprivation, and squalor. On top of all this, I was also aware of the enormous challenges facing the smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, such as climate change, environmental degradation, desertification, sea encroachment, soil erosion, locusts, insects, and pests, and lack of technology and finances to increase agricultural food productivity. But against the background of all these formidable challenges, I was inspired by the knowledge that there are huge potentials and opportunities in the agro-processing and agro-industries in Africa. I was enthused by the realization that Africa has a potential and opportunity to produce more wheat, rice, maize, beans, lentils, vegetables, fish, and meat to feed itself and the rest of the world. I now want to share with you the thought that if a global compact could be reached to channel more international investment and financing to African agriculture and food security, the world could be assured of food security and be able to combat increased food shortages, hunger, and malnutrition that threaten humanity. This is why I proposed, and the African heads of state and government agreed, that within a period of 5 years, Africa must be able to feed itself. And that after 5 years, no child in Africa should die of hunger, starvation, or malnutrition. This, my dear friends, was a bold decision that I want you to reflect carefully in your mind. This calls for determination, commitment, and hard work to be realized. But I believe that this is achievable. In order to realize this, I advocated the African Food Basket initiative that will initially be driven and implemented by African countries with the support of the rest of the world through strategic partnerships that will be developed for the purpose. The purpose of this lecture, therefore, is to invite you to walk with me through a journey of hope and expectation. This is a journey where Africa can truly become the food basket, not only for Africans, but for the rest of the world. I will be asking you all and cooperative partners to focus on improving agriculture and food production in the next 5 years through technological innovations and interventions that will comprise subsidies, increased budgetary allocations, and private sector investment. This also calls for a concrete framework for providing information and communications technology to the African farmers, especially those in rural areas, to enable them to know what food to produce, how to produce it, and when to do so. The African Food Basket proposes a global compact on agriculture and food security, under which African governments and the development partners should agree to renew their commitment to agriculture and food security as a priority agenda in the implementation of the Millennium Development Goals of the United Nations and the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program contained in the Maputo Declaration of the African Union that calls for budgetary allocation of at least 10% to the agriculture sector to achieve an annual growth rate in that sector of at least 6%. In order to realize the African Food Basket, in the next 5 years, it is proposed that the African governments, regional economic communities, and the development partners consider agriculture, food security as a core policy interventions. In other words, intensive efforts should be made to ensure that each nation and each region is food secure. I must say that in Malawi, we have been able to turn our country from a persistently food deficit situation to a food surplus country for the past 7 years. This year, we have produced an estimated 3.8 million metric tons of maize, giving the country a food surplus of over 1.2 million metric tons. In addition, we have increased the output of rice, sweet potatoes, cassava, beans, and lentils. In fact, the challenge facing Malawi now is not how to produce food, but how to store it and where to sell it. So for us, it's a good problem, but it's a good challenge. In fact, I always say that it is good for you to go to bed with a stomachache because you have eaten too much than for you to go to bed with a stomachache because you are hungry. Therefore, I strongly believe that Africa can feed itself and the world. But for this to happen, a paradigm shift is needed both in Africa and the developed countries. One such changes is to improve agricultural productivity through integrated policy frameworks that include the rationalization and harmonization of seed policies, national and international laws, regulations, and procedures for the seed industry in the region, and to enhance free movement of improved varieties of seeds and across the borders. The United Nations, the African Union NEPAD Fertilizer Summit also adopted a 12-point Abuja Declaration on Fertilizer for an African Green Revolution to enhance fertilizer availability, accessibility, and utilization. The Sharm el-Sheikh Declaration, also on the African continent, on response to the challenges of high food prices and agriculture, also developed a consolidated framework to improve agricultural production. Other decisions worth noting include the African Food Summit, the resolution of the Abuja Food Security Summit, and also the NEPAD Green Wall Implementation Strategy. I am saying this in order to bring to your attention that attempts are being made at the African level to address the challenges of food insecurity. This will be enhanced by increasing farmers' access to high quality and affordable seed brands, the expansion of private sector entrepreneurship, and the development and provision of various fertilizer inputs adopted and also produced on the African continent itself. This will in turn increase productivity and therefore reduce food insecurity. I'm looking for a viable conceptual framework, and I'm reminded that history has taught us that a nation that depends on other nations for food cannot really be sovereign. In fact, from times immemorial, those countries that were able to feed themselves survived any external shocks or attacks better than those who could not feed themselves. The Egyptians, pharaohs, for instance, were able to withstand long wars because they always stored enough food for their peoples. By the same token, no nation or region has ever been able to achieve economic takeoff without sustainable food security, which is always a catalyst for growth and development. Therefore, borrowing a leaf from Malawi, an important component of the African food basket, is to determine the agriculture and food policy and make every citizen know and accept that we can feed ourselves. The next step is to provide agricultural inputs as explained earlier. This should be followed by an assessment of the staple diets grown in different countries and create data banks through the use of information and communications technology. Within each region and between various regions, we should also encourage local farmers and investors from other African countries to grow any staple crops for export to their respective countries or to wherever it is needed. I also propose that the adverse impacts of climate change be addressed through the development of extensive irrigation to create green belts along Africa's rivers and lakes and basins and marshes. These would provide new arable lands for growing a variety of food and cash crops. For instance, in Malawi, where we have been able to successfully combat hunger, we plan to irrigate up to 1 million hectares of land. For this to happen, there's need to increase investment in agriculture through budgetary allocations. Malawi now provides at least 20% of its budget to agriculture, food security, and irrigation. And indeed, if the taste of the pudding is in the eating, Malawi is showing the results. So, Mr. Chairman, I am preaching a proven track record of agriculture and food security achievement. Other interventions include promoting large-scale commercial farming through private investment, and the G8 funding for agriculture will also improve prospects in that direction. We also plan to have measures to be taken to make agriculture more profitable and hence attractive to investors. In order for Africa to feed itself, Mr. Chairman, within the next 5 years, agriculture and food security must be given top priority in all African countries and also in the developing partner countries. This can be sustained through huge investment and financial allocation to agriculture and improve efficient utilization of land and water resources for irrigation, increase access to farm inputs, mitigation against climate change, as well as improvement in storage facilities to reduce post-harvest food losses. The African food basket takes full cognizance of the AU New Economic Partnership for African Development, NEPAD. And this comprises 4 mutually reinforcing pillars. First, sustainable land and water management. Second, improved market access and integration. 3, increased food supplies to reduce hunger. And 4, research, technology generation, dissemination, and adaptation. The issue of Africa's political commitment to produce enough food is a vital element for the African food basket. The AU heads of state and government at their summit held in Banjul in Gambia in June 2006 committed themselves to implement the necessary implements to attain at least 10% of allocation of national budgets to agriculture. The challenges identified by African leaders that would affect the implementation of the African food basket include low and stagnant productivity and pervasive poverty, low nutrient applications, especially in organic fertilizer, is also among the major factors contributing to declining agricultural productivity. The Abuja Declaration recognized the need for rapid increases in fertilizer use by millions of smallholder farmers in Africa. Malawi has surpassed that target on fertilizer use, and according to our records, we are using more than 59 kilograms per hectare of arable land. This is because we recognize that the problem of underuse of fertilizer continues in Africa. Hitherto, a few countries, namely Egypt, Malawi, Mauritius, and South Africa, have surpassed that 50 kg per hectare target. And indeed, with proper application, we are seeing that these countries are able to feed themselves. It is important to note that out of the 33 countries for which data is available, about 67% have a formal fertilizer legislation in place. 50% conduct fertilizer inspections for quality control at the point of sale. 80% do not have price controls. 70% do not restrict the types of fertilizer that can be used by their people. 65% of the countries do not have tariffs on fertilizer, and 75% do not have taxes on fertilizer. This shows the variety and differences in the policy interventions that African governments have, and hence the variations in agricultural outputs and also the ability to fight hunger. Let me now turn to infrastructure in support of agriculture. An important element of the African food basket that I want to draw the global attention on is the need to develop and implement a robust program of transport and infrastructural development in support of agriculture, especially road, rail, inland waterways, maritime transports, and ports. The existence of viable transport infrastructure network is essential for trade and transit facilitation. Road transportation plays a key role in Africa's agricultural development and food security, as is the case in other parts of the world. The argument is simple. The African food basket propagates that we cannot achieve food security if we cannot effectively and cheaply transport goods from the food surplus areas to the food deficit areas. It is therefore envisaged that new regional partnerships must be agreed for financing both national and cross-border road infrastructural projects to support the transport of food. The regional, institutional, and policy reforms in agriculture need to be scaled up by introducing innovative means for mobilizing funds towards infrastructure investment. I'm happy to say that the regional economic communities in Africa have established various transport corridors that link together many countries as well as the rest of the world, and that support food security. With regard to railways, it's a different story. We believe that railways can play a critical role in the realization of the African food basket. But it is a matter of concern that during the past 5 decades, Africa has witnessed the decline in the share of cargo carried by rail. This is because international organizations, including the World Bank, had systematically discouraged the construction of new railways in Africa. Similarly, funding for the repair and maintenance of existing railway line was drastically reduced. This was a grave error of judgment and resulted in the operating losses of the railways, hence forcing governments to expend substantial public funds in order to bail out the railway companies. The African food basket therefore calls for the development of a model railway concession for Africa, following the study on the regional economic communities' railway concessions. A new program to finance the rail infrastructure and rolling stock should be developed. New railway development projects that are underway within the framework of the African Union also need to be encouraged. Therefore, we are looking at improvements of the, for instance, the Djibouti, Ethiopian, and Sudan railway link, the Kenya, Sudan, Ethiopia link, the Kagera Basin Railway, and that one linking Rwanda and Burundi. In the near future, we'll be looking also at the possibility of linking Uganda with the new Republic of South Sudan to give them an outlet to the sea. The African food basket must also be supported by viable ports and harbors. For many landlocked countries, such as Malawi, the intermodal transport system that combines railway, ports, and harbors, as well as road and coastal and inland transport, is of special interest in increasing the role of agriculture in Africa's future development. Many ports continue to experience considerable congestion, leading to long delays in transshipment of goods from overseas to the inland countries. For this reason, Malawi is pioneering the development of the first ever Nsanje World Inland Port on the Shire River to save Mozambique, Malawi, Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, as well as Rwanda and Burundi. Similarly, we are looking at concrete measures to address the issue of congestions at some of the ports that serve landlocked countries in Eastern, Southern, Central, as well as West Africa. With regard to energy, I have a new slogan which says energy for agriculture, and this is what I'm proposing in the African food basket, and I'm proposing to you. I believe energy is a precondition for economic and social development, and indeed the survival of mankind. The African leaders recognize that the energy sector in most parts of Africa is underdeveloped and unequipped to sustain modern industries. Essentially, the energy sector is characterized by lack of access to power, lighting, especially in rural areas where low energy efficiency and over-dependence on traditional biomass is prevalent. In fact, the energy per capita intensity in sub-Saharan Africa is extremely low, at almost less than half of the world's average. The challenge, therefore, is to reduce the high dependence on traditional sources of energy, such as biomass and firewood, in rural areas and peri-urban areas in order to improve productivity. I'm glad to say that the African governments have initiated national, regional, and clear power projects to enhance energy supply on the such as the Grand Inga Dam construction in the Congo River, the Kapichira Phase 2 project in Malawi, the Southern African Power Pool on the Zambezi, and the second Mozambique-Zimbabwe interconnector, to name only a few. These will assist Africans to have power grids that can be combined together. In fact, the dream is that it should be possible 10, 15 years from now for Eastern Africa to be connected with Central Africa with West Africa, so that in fact the power that we might use in Malawi may not necessarily be generated in Malawi, could be generated anywhere in West Africa. That way will give a guarantee to sustainable energy sources of supply, which at the moment, for some of you who have visited Africa, the blackouts are quite frequent. In fact, in some cases, there are more blackouts than the lighting situation. So you wonder what you can do. Now, let me turn to information and communication technology. The information and communication technology plays a significant role in agriculture in developed countries such as the United States and Europe. But in sub-Saharan Africa, most technological breakthroughs in science and technology do not reach the rural farmers. And so our effort is to increase the development of such technology in order to ensure that farmers have access to where to get the supply of agricultural inputs, such as fertilizers, improved seeds, insecticides, and pesticides within and among the regions, as well as from the world at large. I'm therefore inviting you to think how developed countries can assist Africa to create a comprehensive database on agriculture and food security so that countries and regions share such information and technologies. There is need for countries and international institutions to establish food security data banks for information exchange on commodity trading as well as on early warning systems. The African countries, I'm glad to say, are now committed to ensure that information and communication technology is an important tool for enhancing agricultural activities in member states. This is important insofar as it assists even governments to plan well for agriculture and food security. With regard to climate change and environment, we know that these have played a devastating impact on African agriculture and food security. In recognition of this, the African countries have come together to work out on a framework intended to have sustainable development while focusing on poverty reduction and on increased agricultural food productivity. The African food basket calls for effective action to mitigate shortages of rainfall resulting from climate change through irrigation. We need to have increased investment in water development for irrigation, farming, reforestation through sustained tree planting, as well as the green revolution that is taking place in Africa. To that end, I strongly urge the developed countries to review their policy and criteria for awarding the carbon credits, to extend this to African governments, non-government organizations, and individuals that excel in tree planting as a national policy. This must be premised on the recognition that Africa is the most vulnerable region to climate change, with the least adaptive capacity to protect themselves. A global partnership to mitigate this is a very immediate policy. Africa is also gravely affected by the greenhouse gas emissions, and there is need to have a primary mechanism to prevent long-term climate impacts on the development of agriculture. With regard to irrigation, I wonder whether you know that Africa has abundant water resources for irrigation, but presently only 7% of arable land is irrigated. This compares poorly with 29% and 41% in South America and Asia, respectively. The potential for irrigation in Africa is therefore enormous and estimated up to 42 million hectares that can be brought under irrigation. Rain-fed agriculture is often insufficient to permit high-yield varieties to achieve their full potential. We have, like in other parts of the developing world, rain makers, but these do not help us much. So we need to look at other means of making rain. In fact, one time I was in Latin America, I don't know whether it was Mexico, I found a stick that had something inside, I don't know what it is. And when you turned it, you get a sound like rain. And I was told that, this one can produce rain. So I took it with me to Malawi. I kept on turning like that. And somehow the rains did not come. maybe I wasn't doing it properly. But so what I'm saying is that really we do have potential for irrigation. The green belt concept suggests that we should be able to irrigate at least up to 20 or 50 kilometers outside the river banks, lakes, and swamps. And that green belt on its own, if we did that on the Nile, we did that on the Congo, we did that on the Limpopo, and several other rivers, Niger, we could, using that alone, be able to feed Africa, even if the rain did not come. So that is really the concept of that green belt. But all in all, this calls for new irrigation initiatives that will draw upon the experiences and expertise of the countries that have been involved in irrigation for a long time, such as Egypt, Libya, and Sudan, for instance. There will also be need to establish cooperation with those countries in the south with irrigation experiences, such as India and Brazil, and of course the United States, developed countries, and some European countries, which knowledge can be transformed to Africa to improve the use of agriculture for food sustainability. Let me say something about the controversial agricultural subsidies. As many of you know, that Malawi had to wrestle with some of the international institutions because we wanted to introduce agricultural subsidies. The argument was very simple. In the industrialized countries, including the United States, Europe, and Japan, and so on and so forth, you have very sophisticated agricultural systems using tractors, implements, and even technology, early warning systems, etc. They do receive huge amounts of subsidies. In Malawi and other sub-Saharan African countries, agriculture is done essentially by women. You get a woman with a hoe, with a baby on her back, at midday in the burning sun, probably had not even a cup of tea or water. And we are told that that woman does not need subsidies, but the farmers in Europe and North America do. That was where the battlefield was set. I decided that with the support of the international community, I will introduce the subsidies. But as a pragmatist, I said I'll give this experiment 3 years. And I said that if within a period of 3 years I'm unable to feed my people, I will admit I've failed, I'll take my briefcase and go home. And indeed, year one, we already started producing surpluses. As I said, we had one surplus bumper year after another for the last 7 years, and I've been able to take Malawi from a chronic food deficit to almost a permanent food surplus. We have been able to provide food aid to other countries in sub-Saharan Africa from a small country like Malawi. In fact, recently we sent over 200 metric tons of rice to Haiti when there was that disaster in Haiti. So I'm pleading for support from some of you who have connections to say that we understand the basis upon which the industrialized countries provide subsidies to their people. We also want the industrialized countries to understand the basis upon we provide subsidies to our people. That's all. we're asking for. And that's not defiance, it's not war, it's just stating the facts are there. Let me now turn to how the African food basket will be implemented. I'm suggesting that there be strategic partnership for agriculture and food security. And this will be divided in several areas. African governments must take the leading role and cooperate with each other within the African economic groupings. But African governments also must collaborate with the G20 countries in support of agriculture. The third one is that African governments must collaborate with the private sector in order for investment to take place in agriculture. And the fourth paradigm is that the African sector enterprise must cooperate with one another through joint ventures in agriculture. But to do that, the African governments must give policy guidelines and adequate incentives for private sector participation in agriculture, because agriculture is often looked at as a non-lucrative business ventures. So we need to have a mind shift, because at the end of the day, we are saying unless we are able to feed the world. By the way, I will not look at food security as anything in Malawi, for instance, if the neighbors do not have enough food security. And I will not look at food security at the African level if at global level there are food shortages. So what we are asking for is a global compact that will ensure that the African food basket will also be producing enough food, not only for the African people, but for the rest of the world. We believe that through multiple interventions, there should be guaranteed food at affordable prices for many people around the world, including, as I said, food, peacekeeping forces, national armies, hospitals, and schools. This would in turn bring down the cost of living through price deflation that would ensure sustainable real growth of the world economy. I believe if we all work together in a compact, we could turn up with a win-win situation all around. The G20 would have a significant role, naturally, because of their advances in technology as well as the funding. But I'm glad to say that the issue of food security, not only at Africa level, but at the global level, acquired significance when the G8 most industrialized countries, together with the international and regional organizations, declared their deep concern, and I quote, about the global food security, the impact of global financial and economic crisis, and the hike in food prices on the countries least able to respond to increased hunger and poverty, end of quote. I'm happy that the G20 later on acknowledged this, that, and I quote, the combined effect of long-standing investment in agriculture, the combined effect of long-standing underinvestment in agriculture and food security, price trends, and the economic crisis have led to increased hunger and poverty in developing countries, plunging more than a further 100 million people into extreme poverty and jeopardizing the progress so far achieved in meeting the Millennium Development Goals, end of quote. This is a quote from G8, G20 countries. I believe this is a good beginning because it represents a paradigm shift, very strong paradigm shift. In recognition of this and the efforts made in Africa to deal with food security issues, the G8 countries, through the joint L'Aquila Joint Statement on Global Security, which is called the L'Aquila Food Initiative, committed themselves to take all necessary measures to achieve global food security by substantially increasing aid to agriculture and food security by mobilizing at least 20 billion United States dollars, including what they called multi-year resource commitments. Therefore, on its part, Africa should constantly dialogue with the G8 governments to persuade them to honor their historic pledge to support agricultural development and to free humanity from hunger and poverty. They have been urging them to develop quick disbursing mechanisms to release funds so quickly that were committed under the L'Aquila Food Initiative. The new technological innovation should also include research under the G8 support in science and technology, start introducing subsidies for African smallholder farmers to enable them to produce beyond subsistence. We believe that at the same time, medium and large-scale commercial farmers in Africa should be given appropriate incentives, including technological and financial packages, to increase their capacities to agricultural research, agro-processing and manufacturing, and to enhance Africa's competitiveness in the regional and global market. This, in my view, would directly respond to the clear and bold paradigm shift in the regional agriculture and food security intervention made by the United States President Obama when he proposed at the G20 summit that instead of continuing to give food aid to Africa and other developing countries, American aid should assist and strengthen the capacities of African countries to produce enough food for themselves. In doing so, President Obama was giving credence to the old adage that says, give a person a fish today and he will be hungry tomorrow. But teach the person how to fish, he will never be hungry again. I think for the strategic partnership to work, African governments should, on their part, implement decisions they have already taken in recent years to increase agricultural production and food security. More especially, African countries should increase fertilizer allocation to the poor farmers as well as other extension services. I must add that in order to mitigate the adverse effects of climate change and reduce dependence on rain-fed agriculture, it should be important under the L'Aquila Initiative to create industries that, or manufacturing concern, that produce irrigation equipment, tractors, and agricultural implements. This to be made available to small, medium, and large-scale farmers. We believe also the private sector has a role to play in the African food basket by stimulating Africa's agricultural productivity, especially investment in African agriculture and related sectors, such as I said, energy, and through public-private collaboration. Such partnership could also include the provision of the supplies for the Green Belt Initiative or the African Green Revolution. At the African level, I have proposed that for the African food basket to work, there should be a body of 17 countries, called the Strategic Group of 17. Its principal role would be to spearhead and monitor the progress towards turning Africa into a food basket. Members would include countries with track records of achievement in agriculture and food security. Specifically, the SG17 group will have the following functions: to coordinate strategies in the implementation of the African Union decisions on agriculture and food security and other initiatives in the field, and to design the best methods of achieving food security for all African countries within the period of 5 years. The group will also liaise with the G8 governments and their bilateral and multilateral institutions to develop the modus operandi for ensuring how developed countries can assist Africans to design new and best practices for enhancing agricultural development and achieve food security for Africa and the rest of the world. The third one would be to facilitate seed production and marketing policies within and among regional economic communities, and to improve free movement of goods and services related to agricultural production and food security. I want to conclude this discourse by asking a mundane question. Can Africa feed the world? The answer is yes. The African food concept is designed not exclusively as an African affair, but a global affair. As an integral part of the global village, Africa's agriculture and food security must be redesigned to be part of the global effort to address the issues of world food shortages and rising food prices. It is in this context that I'm confident that the G8, G20 leaders and other cooperating partners will meet their commitment to agriculture, development, and food security. The paradigm shift further builds upon the global partnership with the G8 countries in their resolve to mobilize adequate financial and technical resources for agricultural, food production, nutrition security, and other related matters in Africa. I have no reason to doubt the commitment of the G8 to meet their pledge. More significantly is the fact that through a successful implementation of African Food Basket, the African development partners will be assured of Africa meeting the Millennium Development Goals. In addition, Africa and the G8 governments should agree to fund subsidies designed to increase application and use of agricultural inputs by poor farmers, such as fertilizers, improved seeds, pesticides, and extension service to raise their productivity of food and cash crops. This should be supported by Africa's farmers to have easy access to credit facilities on short term. It is in this context that the African Food Basket, that I'm appealing to the G8, G20 leaders and other cooperating partners to help meet its commitment to agriculture development as echoed through the African Union decisions. I strongly believe that through the African Food Basket Initiative, Africa will positively contribute towards the development of global agriculture and food security. Africa will also be at the forefront in mitigating the effects of price increases and food insecurity, thereby contributing to peace and stability in the world. Africa is calling for a global commitment by world leaders to position food and nutrition security at the center stage of development. Indeed, 5 years from now, with the Global Compact, Africa should become the food basket of the world. Together, I believe we can make this happen. I thank you. God bless you all.
Thank you very much, President Mutharika. That was a comprehensive and very, very intriguing and informative presentation. It's impossible to make a summation of it, of course, but I think a couple of issues that the American policymaker listening to this presentation can take away that I think will encourage us all is the commitment, not just political, but resource commitment that you and your African heads of state are making to food security. We all agree with the issue of food security is essential to peace and security and development in Africa. I think that's something that's been recognized for a while. Certainly, President Obama recognizes here in the United States and has made food security one of the cornerstones of his policy towards Africa and the developing world. But the kind of commitment is testified by the 10% budget allocations that you're asking African governments to make, I think really makes it and opens a door for a true partnership here. I really thank you for this sterling presentation. As you know, coming out of this are such initiatives as the Feed the Future policy that USAID has established, and I think is working closely with you on. We do have time for a few questions. The President has agreed to take a few questions on his Feed the Future, on his African Food Basket initiative. We are being webcast live, and so I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you want to ask a question of the President. I will recognize you. Please identify yourself to the President and then ask your question. I think we'll take 3 questions at a time to make it easier to handle, and we can do them all. Wait for the microphone to come your way, and then we'll get right to Larry.
Lawrence Freeman from Executive Intelligence Review, the Africa Desk. Your Excellency, I think your remarks are very much to the point. I've followed your work in Malawi for a long period of time and written about it. And I think if you look at the policies of globalization and the WTO over the last 10, 15 years, they have actually made it harder for African countries to feed themselves, which African countries did do up into the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. My one question to you, sir, is in terms of infrastructure. I would approach it from the standpoint of having an infrastructure platform of integrated advanced technology infrastructure which drives the economy for food and manufacturing. That is, east-west railroads, water development, power development on a regional level. Develop the potential, for example, of Sudan, which has 80 million hectares, which could feed all of North Africa and the Horn. This kind of approach for food is different than what has been put forth now, and it cannot be done by the private sector, and it won't be done by the financial market to the marketplace. I would ask you to think about the idea of governments setting up a new arrangement to generate credit for long-term investment by government to government, not the private sector, for infrastructure projects that will take 10 or 20 years, but will actually be a platform to drive the economy forward. We are in a food shortage right now. We're also suffering massive food speculation by speculators. The same guys who destroyed the U.S. economy on the housing bubble are now speculating in food. The head of my organization, Mr. LaRouche, has called for what Roosevelt did in 1942, emergency law to crush speculators by putting a cap on food prices. I also want to know what you thought of that idea. Thank you, sir. And again, I support all the initiatives that Malawi is taking right now.
Thank you, Larry. We'll take one more from the back there. Derek, if you can get there. And I think one more for this because Larry's question was full of multiple questions. So,
I'm Mahmoud Qasim, and I used to farm in Zambia. I had 16,000 acres in 4 farms, including one tobacco farm across the border from Chipata, or chips as we called it. We used to look after our neighbors who were almost, as you say, women, overworked, overburdened. So we used to do the plowing and seeding, did all what we call support farming for them. And I got about 3.5, 4 tons an acre. And after a bit of practice, they got almost 3.5 tons an acre. The whole thing collapsed, thanks to Kenneth Kaunda and maybe the World Bank, because the country went bankrupt. They were not paying us. There was no fertilizer, there was no petrol. You know the story, okay? How do you see, you've done a macro view of African regional cooperation. How do you see the micro operating? How do you actually get to support these peasant farmers and help them get better?
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. President. I think that gives you a lot to respond to. First question.
Yes.
Irrigation East. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think I do agree with you that what's happening in international negotiating frameworks like the WTO and others make it really very difficult for us to concentrate, as developing countries, on the production of food to feed our people. That's pretty much the same. And but I do agree that you need to have an integrated structure, not only infrastructure, not only of the modes of transportation, but I think including trade, investment, industrial development, agro-processing, etc. All these must be put together. In fact, at the moment, what we are looking for is really a value addition in agriculture. You take tobacco, for instance, take tea, take sugar, take cotton, and so on and so forth. Presently, these are taken out of Africa in raw form. And by so doing, we are, in effect, exporting jobs. As a matter of fact, the other day, I was talking to some European policymakers, and one of them was worried that there's so much, immigrants, so many immigrants coming out from Africa into Europe and causing a lot of problems. I said, sure. The answer to me is very simple. You took away their jobs from Africa into Europe, so they are coming following their jobs. It's as simple as that. Because the moment you start processing, whether it's agro-processing, processing of minerals in Africa, establishing huge factories, you create employment. And I can assure you, many of them, some of them, I've actually talked to them, they would not want to leave their homes if they can get jobs there. But you've taken the jobs into Europe. So that, again, is part of the package. In fact, by doing that, you're also removing able-bodied men and women who could work in agriculture. They are now in Europe trying to get a job. So you are reducing the capacity for agricultural production. So it's an integrated program, and I agree with you that perhaps this should be the way. You've talked about government-to-government financing, giving financial credits. Yes, indeed, we are in Malawi, in fact, doing that. The Green Belt is premised on the fact that government has to intervene, for instance, to create the infrastructure. If you create a big area, people have to be resettled. And when they are resettled, you have to give them schools, hospitals, and all that. That will be the role of the government. But in terms of actual production or transformation of value addition into these raw materials, up to now, it's essentially a private sector initiative. But the challenge is, can you get the private sector to be interested in this? That is the challenge. And so we are trying to create a framework where this is so. For instance, in Malawi, I'm telling the private sector, say, look, when you have the green belt, you have several chances. There will be companies to supply cement for making, building the canals. You have companies to supply tractors and agricultural implements. You have companies to supply treadle pumps and diesel pumps for water. You have companies that will transport the goods. So you have to try and package this in such a way that the private sector can see a small portion of that activity for themselves. Because the bottom line, no private sector will go into philanthropy. You are not able to force them. Indeed, if governments were able to do this from government to government, that would be the issue. But some will argue that the role of the government is to govern, not to go into business. Mm-hmm. Some people say that. And some people say, no, but the government needs to give directive and direction to industry. So I think one of the tricks of governance is to try and draw a balance, how far can the government go and where should the private sector go. But we are discussing, and I think it's a process, of dialogue. And as we are moving along, we are beginning to get a sort of consensus as how best, what contribution of government can be in agriculture and food security, and what contribution can be the private sector. But at the moment, it has to be a medley of the two. And otherwise, it's not a clear-cut division of labor as such. Now, you were talking about Zambia, that I think some operations, especially for micro operators or small-scale farmers, would collapse because of lack of probably credit support. And that's true. That's very true. In fact, if you went to Malawi, you'll be surprised that all that food security and the figures I've been talking about, they are not essentially from commercial farmers. There are very few commercial farmers. All the food is produced by small, micro farmers. Small, some of them just 1 hectare or 2 acres or something like that. But what we did was, because of the land tenure system, we realized that we cannot go in for huge commercial farms like you can do in South Africa or Zimbabwe, or even in Zambia itself, by the way. They've got a lot of land. In Malawi, we don't. So we made interventions at that micro level. Some of them wanted simply a bag of 50 kgs of fertilizer, that's all. And we said, if that's all she wants or he wants, we give them. Some of them even split that bag with friends. But the results have been absolutely overwhelming. Some, about 2-3 months ago, a bunch of women, came to see me just to tell me that for all their lives, each one of them was testifying that for all their lives, they were never able to produce more than 3 or 4 bags of 50 kgs of maize on their piece of land. But as a result of the subsidized fertilizers, they were able, now some of them, 14, 15, 17 bags. And they have a lot of surplus. Besides feeding themselves, they can also sell some to get income for themselves. So life is improving for them. In fact, in some areas, actually, instead of 1 bag of maize, someone said, how many Bingus did you get this year? Bingu is my name. So now, instead of saying how many bags of maize, he says, how many Bingus? He says, oh, I got 10 Bingus today. Which is... So, but certainly, I think governments, from our experience, need to listen and to intervene more decisively to assist small-holder farmers. Otherwise, you wipe them out of existence. And in the case of Malawi, if you do that, you really are heading for disaster.
Okay, thank you, Mr. President. You may not know, but you were so popular today that we had to create an overflow room. So there are other people besides those you see in front of you who are watching on a big screen television, and I invited them to send in some questions. So I'm going to read 2 questions from the holding room, where they are listening intently. The first one is, please clarify the position of the Africa Food Basket Initiative on genetically modified seeds and crops and foods, if you have a position on that. And the second question is, how do you plan to use extension services with the local farmer and village leaders? Will they have the opportunity of partnering and being taught and guided by Extension Services?
Yes. Well, I think these are very pertinent questions. First of all, the debate on whether or not to use genetically modified goods is really inconclusive. Sometimes it's become almost religious, because once something goes to religion, nobody wins, nobody loses. But I always ask the question, even for those who say they will definitely not allow genetically modified goods. I said, fine. Then I asked them, when you apply fertilizer to a piece of land that was giving you 2 bags, and now it gives you 10 bags, what have you done? You have actually genetically modified. Because in a natural way is that you would produce only 2 or 3 bags. But if you produce 10, clearly you have genetically modified. Okay. In about a month ago, I went to the trade fair, international trade fair in Malawi, and I saw some of the crops. I saw a sweet potato, huge, very big. I could hardly carry it. But when I was growing, I knew the size of sweet potatoes. I saw cassava as long as from here to the end of the table. Now, what has happened? Clearly, you have genetically modified. But the same people will come and say, we will not want to have GMOs. So if you get oranges and they're seedless, you get grapes and they're seedless, and you all love seedless grapes. But you know that grapes must have seeds. And if they don't have seeds, what has happened? You have genetically modified them. So that's why I was saying sometimes we argue, you know, I mean, I can say even goats. So now goats that give you more meat than before, and cows, a cow that will give you 10 liters of milk now gives you 25 liters of milk. You are genetically modifying these things without saying so. So I don't know, but I cannot say that it's good or it's bad. But all I know is that it's happening. Now, with the extension services, this is very critical, because even for us in Malawi, when we're introducing the fertilizer subsidy program, we really had to train the people how to use it. First of all, we used the traditional chiefs. We made them understand that it's important for them to use this and they'll produce more. Some were skeptic, others didn't understand at all, others understood it, all right? But having gone that step with their leaders, the traditional chiefs, we needed to go to the farmer himself or herself and tell them how to apply the fertilizer. Because for you to get a certain output, you must apply it properly. If you apply too much, you burn the seed. If you apply too little, it doesn't work. So we needed this. And it must be combined with, if you are doing irrigation, with the proper irrigation facilities. So indeed, extension services were very important. And in Malawi also, we had to change the way the farmers grew their maize. Traditionally, we used rows, or ridges, right? And then we planted on top of the ridges. But what happens is that when you plant on top of the ridges and apply fertilizer, when the rain comes, the fertilizer washes away in between the ridges, out of the reach of the maize, because the maize does not have long roots. So people were wondering what was happening, that you applied fertilizers and you're not getting what you wanted because it washed away. So we said, why don't you apply use on flat land? Of course, many of them thought it's madness because all their lives they've been planting on ridges. So now you're saying flat land. See, you're not making sense. So we had to demonstrate. I had to do it on my own farm to show the people because I never preached something that never worked. And I asked them, some of them, to come and see how my farm was. And indeed, the other thing, by the way, was that in the traditional planting in Malawi, we put 2 or 3 maize seeds in one hole, all right? And so it was thought that that way you produce more, right? And if you told them that if you put 1 seed per hole and you produce, and that your output will be more, it didn't make sense to them. He said, what do you mean? You know, instead of planting 3 or 2, I'm planting 1, and you say I'll produce more, I'll get more out of 1. So it was a mindset. And then we had again to demonstrate that actually when you plant 1, when the maize goes up there, it usually has 2 big cones. I mean, what?
Years, yeah.
Years of, corn, instead of 1. Whereas if you plant so many of them in one hole, they compete. So that only 1, the rest really don't give you much. So over time, they accepted this. So extension services are extremely important to change the mindset. Otherwise, it does not work. And during the colonial days, our former colonial masters, the British, came out with very good ideas when I look back. But the way they introduced them, they did not explain the ordinary people to understand why they're doing it. They simply said, do it, or else we'll imprison you. So people rejected. I know in my own village, people rejected this thing. But now by explaining, people understand that it's for their own good. So it takes a lot of, really patience and training. But through extension services, these things can happen, including, by the way, information on market. If you use only 6 bags of maize a year, but you are produce 13, what do you do with the others? We have to tell them that they can sell, we can tell them where to sell it. It's a good, very good question that we get, yes.
I'm really happy to hear that answer because I grew up on a small family farm in the Midwest in the 1950s, and I think here in the United States we've forgotten how important the Agricultural Extension Service was to our own production. Okay, we're going to take one more round of questions, and then the President's going to have to go. So we will start right here in the middle, there. Microphone's coming from this side.
Thank you for having this. My name is Nolu Crockett Ntonga with Communication and Outreach Strategies. Your Excellency, as you know, U.S. private investors are woefully ignorant about opportunities in Africa. And I wonder, because the program, the potential is just so awesome, and obviously you do need those strategic partnerships. What are your thoughts about how to persuade U.S. and other investors and partners in light of the perception of Africa's persistent corruption, the perception of persistent corruption? Thank you.
Okay. And I saw one in the middle right back there. Yes.
Good afternoon, President. My name is Magami, so I'm from South Africa. Thank you very much for informing us of the initiative. And of course, I have a number of concerns. However, I'd like to participate in investing in the initiative. So I don't know, should I give my name somewhere and so forth?
Okay. How does she participate? We'll take one more question right here. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. President, for sharing your brilliant ideas on the African food basket. My name is John Shikatano. I'm with the U.S. Agency for International Development. My question concerns the distinction between agricultural productivity, for which Malawi is clearly a leader and the world is looking to Malawi as a leader in this regard, versus food security, which is widely thought to be more complex and linked to poverty and persist even in countries that have food surpluses. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Private investors is our first question.
Okay. I do agree with you that I think there's a lack of knowledge of, Africa by the U.S. farmer, and investors of the opportunities that exist there. But I can tell you that huge investment opportunities do exist in Africa, especially with regard to the green belt. Because in the green belt, we'll be looking at, for instance, production of wheat, which is required for bread throughout the world. And there are huge opportunities for that. In fact, the advantage of that type of farming, and wheat, maize, beans, and so, is that really is so short term. You can actually determine whether you are successful. In my own country, in Malawi, you plant around December. By April, May, you're harvesting. You already can tell whether or not you did the right thing. But in most cases, the returns are enormous, in the same as in cotton, for instance. It's the same period. You plant around that, and in about 3 or 4 months down the line, you begin to harvest cotton. So your investment comes in, and yields the results within a very short period of time. But what we don't have is a system of communicating with the possible investors in the United States, or even to interest them. I lived here in Washington. I worked in the World Bank. And I met, by the way, I met some Washingtonians. One of them I was chatting with, he says he has never been to New York. Why? Because, you see, you Americans are so self-sufficient that, if you are in Reston, in Virginia, everything else will get there. So why should you care to come to D.C. when you can get everything there, And I think that in itself make you so confined to narrow areas that you really would not want to see, you miss the opportunities beyond the United States. If a Washingtonian has never been to New York or is not interested in going to New York or California or Chicago, do you think he will be interested to go to Malawi? So I think, I think it's going to be a process. By the way, without derogating on somebody, I met once, many years ago, no now, I met, we had there was a party somewhere, and I met a chairman of the Congressional Committee on Africa.
Could be,
yes. Yes, some years back. And we met, so where are you from? I said, I'm from Malawi. So he says, it's near Mauritania. Clearly, he was the chairman of the Committee on Africa, and he thought Malawi was probably Mali, and I gave him the credit for that, and it's near Mauritania. So that shows you that maybe he doesn't have time to look at the other things. But let's make it happen. But let's make it happen by exchanging more and more information. We need Americans to come and visit African countries and vice versa. So as we visit, I think we'll be able to know more. Certainly for the African food basket, we'll need that kind of interaction. As for the corruption, I think we mentioned about corruption. Well, I think corruption is a big issue. We are all tackling it in different ways, But one of the things we are finding difficult as policymakers is that in Africa, someone is accused of using maybe an equivalent of maybe $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 that he cannot account for through corrupt practices. All right? And for the donors, that's big news. But when you come to industrialized countries, someone gives himself a bonus of $450 million bonus salary. It's not corruption. Is what I'm trying to say. Yeah. So I think it's just perception. I'm not saying that because it's a small amount, it's not bad. No. But because we are on the receiving end, this tends to be exaggerated much more than it does in the other places. Some years back, 12 commissioners of the European Commission resigned because of corruption. The issue lasted less than 2 weeks. So dead. But if it is in Africa, they employ their own people, they will be repeating it and repeating it and repeating it. It's a big news. So there is that imbalance in the way it's treated. However it is, corruption is bad. Now, you are talking about productivity versus security, and also, of course, it affects the poverty coefficient. Well, actually, I would like to submit that it's not possible for you to have security, food security, if your productivity is low. So I don't think that it's really one versus the other one. It's one with the other one. They must go side by side. For you to be able to be food secure, you must produce more. And as I said, we have made our farmers in Malawi more productive because they're now producing more food per hectare than before. And as a result, they are not only food secure, but they're able to sell. So I would like to suggest that it's not really an either-or situation, but it's a moving together situation, taking both together as policy interventions. Right?
Do you have some word of advice for our young student who asks how she can participate?
How she can participate?
Participate in the Africa Food Basket Initiative.
Ah, well,
is there a public role?
Yes. First of all, if you have money. But we do especially initially in things like extension services, for instance. I use a lot of graduates at the university, even at my own farm, who come in during holidays, and we tell them what to do, and they go around and start, teaching people on extension services. So when you are ready to come for holidays, we'll contact my ambassador, the Malawi ambassador, and would love to see you come and with that. I hope I've not missed the question.
Have we missed the question? Derek, please.
Can you say it again?
Perhaps I should rephrase my question. Actually, what I was saying is that where I'm currently working, they do look into investing in Africa, and this week we were actually working on trying to find potential, basically initiatives to invest in, so it would hopefully eventually become a financial investment.
Where is it you work? That was part of the problem.
Okay.
We didn't know.
All right. Because it's not official yet, I cannot disclose the name,
Okay.
but I could tell you afterwards. But I mean, the director could potentially be watching this.
Oh,
Okay.
everybody's watching.
Okay.
Your cover is blown.
Well, thank you for sharing us with your secret, and definitely we work on that. But when you have developed your ideas, let us know, because either through the chairmanship of the African Union, I'm still the rapporteur of the African Union. In any case, I'll be in charge of the food basket for a very long time because I want to see it happen. Because if I drop it, some other people may not have the same enthusiasm that I have. So I'll continue with it. So when you are ready with that concept, let us know. And definitely, although I understand you're coming from South Africa, we'll persuade you to come to Malawi first before you get to South Africa, and we'll receive you.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I ask you to join me in thanking the President again for his wonderful presentation, let me ask you to remain seated as the President and the Presidential Party leave the building. This will be the end. Thank you, Mr. President, for a really, really enlightening and interesting presentation.